Have you ever heard of the classic creepypasta trope of the lost episode? The kind of stories where someone stumbles across an old cartoon which seems innocent at first, but slowly devolves into something terrifying. I remember reading a ton of these stories when I was younger on the internet, and they used to keep me up at night. The idea of old beloved cartoons from my childhood being corrupted by such morbid ideas as these stories was something I had a really hard time dealing with as a child, but in a weird way, it made me obsessed with them. I always wanted to see how far I could get into stories such as Candle Cove or the infamous Red Mist, but I usually ended up stopping before the end of the stories out of fear. As an adult now, I don't find these stories scary in the slightest. And I feel like that's for a couple reasons. Firstly, the old creepypastas which use this trope were, for the most part, not the most well written. And secondly, I find that having a terrifying cartoon described to you by someone, rather than witnessing it yourself, takes away a ton of its fear factor because it still has to work within the confines of a story. These two problems I had with this subgenre of creepypasta always made me kind of sad to think about, as I felt for years that the idea of a lost episode cartoon would always be super cool on paper, but never in practice. That was at least until I discovered the web series known as the Walten Files.
It's a brand new day in Little Bond's neighborhood, and a really special one for sure. Little Bond has been waiting all day for his friends to arrive.
So, this is the brand new caretaker for the old Bonnie Smiles facility. I'm recording this because the company requires some type of archives for the work history. What was that thing?
Watched the Walten Files, I was immediately reeled into this series by its ability to recreate that old fear I used to feel towards the lost episode subgenre, encapsulating the idea of a haunted TV program without the two main issues I discussed with the old stories from my childhood. To catch anyone up with what the Walten Files even is, it's a series of FNAF-inspired VHS tapes which catalog the dark events which transpired at the fictional location known as Bond's Burgers. These tapes take the form of employee training tapes, old cartoons, found footage, and even gameplay footage from old arcade games. What makes the series so good and engaging for its viewers is that it carries very clear inspiration from the FNAF series, but never treads too far into the territory of the FNAF universe or characters to be a blatant ripoff. It has its own individual style, and its own way of telling a unique story which we've never seen before. It also uses very different horror elements from the traditional FNAF games which inspired it, using many of the tropes from the analog horror genre it helped popularize. I feel like every single episode that exists for this series is both interesting and terrifying in its own regard, but during my first watch through of the Walten Files, there was one particular episode which stood out to me far more than the rest. One which reawakened that childhood nostalgia of staying up late and listening to lost episode creepypastas, and one which stuck with me days after I finished it. And that episode was The Mysterious House. The Halloween special of the Walten Files, also known by its title The Mysterious House, is a horror short which, in its 13-minute runtime, is able to tell a complete and self-contained story which plays on many of our deepest fears surrounding the holiday. It does a wonderful job at giving us just enough context to know what horrible things are coming over the course of its runtime, but also keeps just enough hidden away that we fear what those horrible things might be. If you haven't watched this short yet, I highly recommend you go watch it before continuing this video. I'd hate to spoil the experience for anyone who's yet to see it themselves, and it's a short video that doesn't rely on the other episodes of the Walten Files to make sense, so it would be an easy watch for anyone who hasn't seen the rest of the series yet. By doing this as well, you'd also be supporting a creator who put a ton of love and effort into the series, which is something they definitely deserve to get something back for. With that out of the way though, let's dive into the specifics of what makes this episode so terrifying compared to everything else which came before and after it, starting with what the short is even about. To those of you who either haven't watched this short or just need a recap, The Mysterious House is an episode of the Walten Files which is centered around a pair of young trick-or-treaters named Ducky and Tammy. Late into the night of Halloween, these two decide that they want to stop at one more house before going home for the night, and the house they end up choosing is the worst one imaginable.
Oh, what about that one?
Upon arriving at the mysterious house, they are greeted by a sheep in a witch costume, who welcomes them inside to get some candy. She takes the kids in, introducing them to her close friends, Billy, TVA,
and the pumpkin rabbit.
After spending some time inside the house, they are then welcomed to stay the night, and being the innocent, naive children they are, they agree. This is where the episode goes from being unsettling to downright horrifying. Near the end of the short, Tammy is woken in the middle of the night to the sound of her friend Ducky calling her name. But something seems off about it. The way Ducky calls her is the same every single time, like some kind of pre-recorded message that's playing on loop. When she goes to investigate what's going on, she sees that the people of the house have changed. Now they appear robotic and refuse to say a word to her as she asks them what's even going on. Now hearing Ducky's voice coming from the basement, Tammy goes down there to investigate, and she finds herself in a long corridor lined with strange-looking doors. Ducky's voice echoes through this hallway, seemingly coming from behind the door at the end of the hall. Tammy, wanting to get out of this place with her friend, ventures inside and discovers the horror of what's happened to Ducky, and what will soon happen to her. This horrifying moment is brought to a close as the pumpkin rabbit leaps on Tammy, causing the short to cut to black and leave us with an end card which shows the aftermath of what he does to her. The story of the mysterious house is a simple one about the terrible things that can happen to children left unsupervised on Halloween night, but it's one which does this idea perfectly. By playing the entire episode around this premise, it plays on a natural fear that everyone has, which is watching those who are innocent and don't know any better walk into a trap they cannot get out of. Tammy and Ducky do nothing wrong throughout the entirety of this short, so when we see the episode begin to foreshadow what may become of them, we begin to fear for their safety. We helplessly watch as they both go deeper and deeper into a place they can't escape from, and as the house they find themselves in deteriorates over the course of the episode, we begin to lose hope for them. And that's the other thing with this video that really messed with me after I finished it. The fact that neither Ducky nor Tammy escape with their lives. In a story like this, not only do you root for at least one of the main characters to escape alive, but you also expect it to happen, seeing as that's how most stories of this type end. But where the mysterious house changes things is that neither of them end up getting out alive, both meeting the same horrible death at the hands of the pumpkin rabbit. It's a really haunting ending, which pulls no punches and sticks with you for a while, even after the initial shock of it ends. This isn't even something that's exclusive to this episode, with many other episodes of the Walten Files showing characters dying, which you sometimes think are immune to that. I feel like it just works to make the series as a whole far more terrifying, because you know that no matter how important or innocent a character may seem, there is always a chance that you'll eventually have to see them end up having the same horrible fate as everyone else. And it was this particular episode which set that mentality up for me, making me far more scared for each and every character I saw in the episodes which followed it. The story of this and other Walten Files episodes do an amazing job at foreshadowing and then showing us nightmarish scenarios where we rarely see the characters escape from. But it isn't just the writing which accomplishes this goal. The writing in this short is great for what it does, but in my opinion, what really carries it to its horrifying status is its visual aspects. So let's talk about that. The art style of the Walten Files is easily one of the most iconic and well-known from any recent horror web series. The way the series is able to blend together both cute cartoony characters as well as horrifying, uncanny animatronics has made it stand out among the many other horror web series that came before it. That combined with its old vintage style makes the Walten Files feel like a VHS you could have found at some thrift store which you shouldn't have bought. And I feel like no other episode exemplifies this idea, like the mysterious house. The short does a very good job at using its art style and visuals to create a sense of dread and suspense even in scenes where nothing dangerous is happening. For example, at the very beginning of the short, when we're greeted by the two main protagonists, Tammy and Ducky. The two of them have very cute and innocent designs which are complemented by the almost cardboard cutout look of the backdrop behind them. But alongside everything which fits into this cute and unassuming art style the short presents, there's one thing which looks horribly out of place, and that's the moon. The moon in the background has been drawn with these horribly realistic eyes, which stare into nothing while the two main characters talk as if they don't even see it. It contrasts everything around them so much that it freaks you out the first time you see it, and it also works to show us that even in an environment where nothing can go wrong, something is lurking in the background, watching Tammy and Ducky, waiting to strike. We see more examples of this visual foreshadowing a little later in the video, when we see a missing person poster for a young child named Johnny Bear, which later appears inside the home of the pumpkin rabbit as a framed photo, accompanied by the photos of many other children in varying camera qualities. What makes this sequence and its visuals so unsettling to me is that not only does it establish that the people in this house were responsible for the disappearance of Johnny Bear, but also that they've been doing whatever it is they do for a very long time, as shown by the camera quality slowly improving in each photo as the camera pans over. Another piece of information we can infer from this small moment in the video is that since the missing person photo is the same one taken by the people in the house, that would imply that not only are the people in the house kidnapping children, but they are then reporting their disappearance to everyone in the neighborhood. All of this really disturbing information is told to us without a single word, with the visuals of this video doing it all for us. It allows us to connect the dots in our heads and we begin to realize how horrible the situation of the two main characters really is. Visual foreshadowing within the episode aside, let's go back to the other aspect of the art used in this episode, which absolutely terrifies me. And that's how it blends together both hyper-realism and its normally cartoony art style. Having hyper-realistic monsters and gore contrast cuter, cartoony characters is something that Martin Walls has done often in the Walten Files series, but I feel like this style of visual horror is at its best during this episode. The sudden switch from the cartoony residents of the house becoming terrifying, towering monsters in the later half is not only scary because of just the way they look, but also because it creates more mysteries which are never properly solved over the course of the video. You begin to question what the residents of the house even are. Are they actually just horribly mutilated people in this world setting? Are they animatronics masquerading as regular people? Or are they something else? Fear of the unknown is one of the most important parts of any horror story, allowing your brain to come up with the horrible images that the story can never properly show you. And the horrifying imagery of the characters in the later half of this episode perfectly encapsulates this idea for me. And speaking of the fear of the unknown, there is one last part of this short's visuals I'd love to discuss, and that's the visuals at the end. At the end of this short, when we get to see what the pumpkin rabbit had done to Ducky as well as the other missing children, we're greeted to the morbid visual of all their mutilated corpses, all the while this cheerful old-timey music plays in the background. To me, this is the scariest scene in the entire video for a plethora of reasons, but the main one is the way Martin Walls made the whole thing look. The corpses which litter the room are barely recognizable anymore, with only the grotesque faces of the children being discernible. It's a horrifying visual not only because of the hyper-realistic nature of it, but also because you can barely tell what was even done to them. Your brain starts to create the imagery of what the pumpkin rabbit would have had to do to turn a bunch of innocent children into horrible, mangled messes, and that visual you make up in your head is far scarier than anything the short could have actually shown you. And all the horror of this scene's visuals comes to an absolute climax when the pumpkin rabbit himself removes his own face, revealing what he really looks like underneath, being even more mangled and mutilated than any of his victims.
You have never strayed, you never saw the cookie, poor little.
And speaking of the pumpkin rabbit, I'd like to dedicate an entire section of this video just to him, because I feel like he is one of, if not the scariest character created by Martin Walls for the series, and he is definitely my favorite. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, the pumpkin rabbit. The pumpkin rabbit serves as the main source of this short's horror, acting as the primary antagonist and as the source of all the foreshadowing I discussed earlier. Everything we see throughout the video exists to set this character up as a disturbing, horrible monster who should not be trusted by any means, and this is immediately conveyed to us from the moment he shows up on screen.
And the pumpkin rabbit.
I feel like this introduction to the character does everything necessary to show us as an audience that the pumpkin rabbit is the one in the house we should be afraid of. The way the music stops as soon as he shows up and the camera stays on him with no words for a solid 8 seconds is extremely unsettling. We as an audience wait for something, anything to happen, and then it just suddenly cuts away as if it never happened at all. I knew from the second he showed up that the pumpkin rabbit was the main threat of this video, and my fear of him only worsened once he started talking.
Pleasure to meet all of you, but we're really just here to get some candy, you know?
Oh, little children. We have plenty of candy for you.
The voice Martin Walls did for the pumpkin rabbit is extremely intimidating, coming off sounding so monotone and dead. It does a perfect job at catching the viewer off guard, and it does an even better job working with the design of the character. When we first meet the pumpkin rabbit, his voice heavily contrasts the more cartoony design of the character and their bright color scheme, making them very unsettling to listen to and look at. However, later on in the short, when his true colors are revealed, the voice perfectly fits with the more monstrous design the pumpkin rabbit takes on, allowing him to move on from being unsettling to downright horrifying. It isn't just his voice that makes the character unsettling, however, as Martin Walls did an amazing job at making everything the pumpkin rabbit does throughout the video come off as either off-putting or downright terrifying. My favorite example of this is earlier on in the short, when Tammy and Ducky decide that they should get going for the night, but the pumpkin rabbit quickly interrupts them, instead telling them to stay for the night.
Well, thanks for the candy, but, yeah, it's getting very late. We should go home now.
Oh, really? Don't you think it's a bit dangerous for two kids like you to be wandering around the streets at this hour?
I mean, yeah, but we still
I have
gotta...
an idea. Why don't you two stay here for the night?
Are you sure? We still need to go home. You sure this is a good idea?
I think it's a great idea. Besides, it'll just be for one night.
This scene really shows off how unnerving the pumpkin rabbit is, seeming so impatient to get the children to stay the night that he isn't even willing to let them talk. It's little things like this which make me terrified of the character, as I can never tell what's really going on inside his head, creating a massive fear of the unknown. And it's that fear of the unknown which brings me to the end of the episode, where the pumpkin rabbit reveals his true colors and shows us the monster he really is. This segment begins in the middle of the night, when Ducky wakes up to leave the room while Tammy sleeps beside him. He never comes back into the room, however later in the night Tammy is woken by the sound of his voice calling to her from outside. This segment is very suspenseful on its own, however with the later context of what's really going on here, it becomes scary. Near the end of the scene, we find out what was really going on was the pumpkin rabbit in the basement, luring Tammy down there with the sound of Ducky's voice, who was already dead. The fact that the pumpkin rabbit can mimic the voices of his victims is an element which genuinely freaks me out more than anything else about his character, because it sets up so many questions which bring new context into scenes which were already terrifying on their own. For example, at the end when he finally kills Tammy and repeats her last words back to her before it cuts to black. What scares me so much about this particular scene is that with the context of the pumpkin rabbit mimicking his victims, it not only implies that he could potentially use Tammy's voice in the future to lure more people away, but also that Ducky's last words were probably him calling out Tammy's name to come and save him before the pumpkin rabbit got him. And then of course, there's the main thing that everyone who watches this video is scared of, and that's at the end when the pumpkin rabbit removes his face. I mean, is there really much I have to say to convince you why this is nightmare fuel? The hyper-realistic, mutilated face, which you can barely even recognize, is a haunting final image to send off the short, and it was the imagery which stuck with me more than anything else after finishing it. It's a terrifying way to end a terrifying story, and I love it for it. The Mysterious House is the episode of the Walten Files which stuck with me more than any other video uploaded by Martin Wall's channel for a plethora of reasons. Its self-contained narrative about fearing strangers on Halloween is one which everyone can feel at some point, and it plays into it really well with its storytelling as well as its visual direction. I know I said this earlier, but if you haven't seen this short already, please go and check it out on Martin Wall's channel. It's only 13 minutes long, and you don't need to have seen any other episodes of the Walten Files for it to make sense. It was a project made from a passion for a franchise which I share, and I'm hoping to shed more light on it than it's already received over the past year. Well, with that out of the way though, I hope you all enjoyed the video today, and I'll see you all in whatever my next project ends up being.